Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com and Weiss Advice here on YouTube, and I'm coming to you from The Good Days, which is my commercial recording facility here in Miami, Florida. So if you happen to be in town, you want to take a look at the spot, hit me up. I'd love to give you a tour of the place. And also, if you're on Instagram, follow at The Good Days 305 so you can check out all of our cool behind-the-scenes photos, things like that, and stay up to date with us. Okay, I want to make a controversial claim here, and that is that Atmos is the future. Well, first of all, let's start with what is Atmos, right? Well, in layman's terms, typically the way that we describe Atmos is complicated surround sound, right? Except for instead of doing quad sound with 4 speakers or typical surround, which is usually 5 speakers or 5 speakers in a sub, it's even more speakers. It's 7 surround speakers, 1 sub, and 4 height speakers that are over your head, or even more than that. Then getting up to things like 9 to 6 and stuff like that. Okay. Before I start saying why I think it's the future, let me explain why a lot of audio engineers do not care for Atmos, and why I think those claims are actually pretty legitimate. Okay, so first of all, the number one reason why audio engineers don't like Atmos is probably, well, it's probably tied with number 2, but I'll start with number 1, and that is, it makes a lot more work for us. Frankly, we already do a lot, and now having to consider an entirely separate format that we need to prepare for adds even more to our plate, and it seems to me that the budget that should go along with that oftentimes isn't included in the conversation, so I understand that frustration completely. The second reason is that the work kind of seems meaningless, and the reason why is because most people do not have Atmos playback systems. Although I'm going to have to put a little asterisk beside that because actually everyone has Atmos playback systems, but that's only if we really dig into what Atmos really is. That's going to come later. But nobody has a surround system, really. We typically are listening on stereo. We usually have headphones or car speakers, or I don't know if anybody still has a boombox in 2025, but generally speaking, speakers come in sets of 2 and not 12. Pretty understandable. So if we're making Atmos mixes, the only way that we really hear Atmos outside of a stereo fold down or a typical stereo fold down is going to be a binaural fold down of some sort or some kind of similar derivative like spatial audio from Apple. Well, right now, we don't have great playback systems for those either. Frankly, the Apple spatial stuff, to me, doesn't really sound all that great. The headphones, the sound bar and everything like that, they sound okay, they're fine, but they're not really doing anything amazing, and our headphones that we commonly use are not exactly fantastically set up for binaural, and so all the cool things that can happen with binaural kind of get lost. Now, there is a third reason why a lot of audio engineers don't like Atmos, and it's because when we switch over to the Atmos version, we typically hear a version of the record that is not as good as the stereo mix, and there's a number of reasons for this. First of all, right now, stereo is still king, and I suspect that will be the case for a very, very long time, if not indefinitely. So the beacon of what is going to make the best version of the record gets set up in the stereo mix, and everything else is just trying to meet that bar. So the best Atmos mixes, when we hear them in stereo, are essentially going to be maybe a tie in terms of quality, or maybe a hair worse, and that typically seems to be the case. In addition to that, Atmos is still fairly new. We're kind of still learning how to make Atmos sound good in a stereo fold down, because the process of creating an Atmos mix is very different than the process of creating a stereo mix in really 2 major ways. The first being that Atmos on most platforms requires a very large dynamic range compared to a typical stereo mix, and on top of that, we have more limitations in terms of the bus processing because we don't have one singular master stereo out in Atmos. We actually have way, 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 way more potentially, and so bus processing doesn't really function the same way at all, and therefore it requires a completely different mindset in terms of making an Atmos mix. So, the bottom line here is that the reasons why audio engineers tend to dislike Atmos are pretty legitimate. Now, I'm going to flip things over, and I'm going to explain why I think Atmos is here to stay. A little earlier, I sort of implied that everything is an Atmos playback system, and that in layman's terms, it's a complicated surround system, but that's not really what it is. See, Atmos is actually a format. It's not a playback mechanism in and of itself. It's a format in which playback can be derived. What does that mean? Well, it means that when we're making an Atmos mix, we're using any setup that we have as a reference, essentially. But what makes the playback is the decoding of what we assign in terms of pan positions and things like that. So we're creating data sets, and I'll give you an example of how that would work. So my Atmos room is 714. I have 4 height speakers, 7 surrounds, and a sub. All right, it's a pretty typical setup. There is a playback system called the Las Vegas Sphere. The Las Vegas Sphere, I believe, is 64 speakers. That's a lot more speakers than what I have. However, I can create an Atmos mix that could translate very easily and scale up to a 64 speaker system. So let's say that I wanted sound that was spinning all the way around this dome-shaped 64 speaker system and it spirals all the way up to the top. I can't do that in a stereo setup. I can't do that in a surround setup. I can't do that with any kind of fixed point setup. But with Atmos, I have scalable objects, which would allow me to do different things based on different decodings. So in other words, I could make that effect by sharing energy between my 12 speakers, right? I could have it start on the bass and go from the right speaker at 100% and then get shared between the side speaker, then shared to the rear speaker. And so the level is playing out of all those speakers, but the proportionality is changing the same way panning works in stereo. That's in my 714 system. And then if I want to raise things up into the heights, well, then I start sharing energy with the heights as it starts going around. But I could take that exact same playback and I could put it to the sphere, and instead of doing it that way with only 12 speakers, well, it could assign those speakers that are all around to actually share the energy independently. So now all of those speakers are firing, and we actually get a very, very literal movement of surround moving and spiraling and everything like that, because we can make Atmos do whatever we want. It's really up to a programmer to figure out a decoding scenario that they like. And that's what spatial audio is from Apple. It's similar to binaural, but the Apple engineers decided that they were going to modify it in a few ways based on the parameters that were being set on the objects embed, right? So Atmos is not really a playback system, it is a format, and it is a format that is future-proofed. So as we start integrating content and film and music with more complex systems and things that can produce more interesting results, Atmos will continue to translate to those ideas. We already see this working very well in the film world. That's why Atmos was originally developed, and it was developed by Dolby, which specializes in film sound. Well, now we're starting to see it in music. The music adaptation has not worked quite as well yet, but I think that that's largely because we're still learning what we can do with the Atmos system and how to create a workaround. In fact, actually, we have a really fun little opportunity because Apple is platforming things in a way that require a certain amount of dynamic range. Well, now we suddenly can start mixing and taking advantage of that full dynamic range. So instead of having things that have a dynamic range of, minus 5 dB, we can take advantage of a full 18 dB full scale of dynamic range, which will create much punchier sounds, much more realistic depth, ultimately a much better sound that's kind of more similar to some of the more dynamic stuff that we were getting in the 70s and 80s, but now with all of the high fidelity technology that we have at our disposal. So ultimately, I do think that Atmos is here to stay. I think it will get integrated into the commonality of our culture more and more as time goes on. And if you ever want to hear something in a full 3-dimensional Atmos space, come on by and check it out over here at The Good Days. All right, let's wrap this up. If you dig this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notification so you get notified. If there's an idea on this topic that you think I missed or you want to just comment on and maybe just go into more depth on, feel free to drop a comment in the comments section. I would love to read what you have to say. And lastly, you know what we say here at Weiss Advice. We are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.